AITAH for telling my sister that I like being the guy women regret? Life has a funny way of playing out, doesn't it? Here I am, 32 years old, living on my own terms, thousands of miles away from where I grew up. I've spent the last decade in Central America, running an ecotourism business with my friend, diving into crystal clear waters every morning, kayaking through rainforests, and living in a way that feels like one long, drawn-out vacation. It's not everyone's dream, but it's definitely mine. I've always known that I didn't want the kind of life I saw so many people around me fall into: getting married, having kids, buying a house, and settling down. Even as a teenager, I felt suffocated just thinking about it. I knew that wasn't for me. That's why, at 20 years old, I made a decision that raised more than a few eyebrows. I got a vasectomy. Yep, made sure there wouldn't be any surprise babies down the road. People thought I was crazy, of course. My parents, my friends, even my older sister, Sarah, gave me grief about it. But I didn't care. I knew what I wanted, or rather, what I didn't want, and I haven't regretted it for a second. The truth is, I like my freedom. I like waking up every morning with no obligations tying me down. No one needing me to be somewhere or do something. I've built a life that's about adventure, about experiences, about living in the moment. I get to spend my days outdoors, guiding tourists through jungles, teaching them how to scuba dive, or leading them on hikes through untouched wilderness. I get to meet people from all over the world. And when the day's work is done, I get to retreat into the quiet, laid-back rhythm of life in a small coastal town. It's simple, it's uncomplicated, and it's exactly what I want. Then there's my love life, or lack of a traditional one. At least, I'm not looking for anything serious. And I've never lied about that. The women I meet, mostly tourists from North America or Europe, know the score. We have fun. We enjoy each other's company for a little while. And then they go back to their regular lives. It's fleeting, sure, but I've never been one for permanence. I like it that way. There's no drama, no heartbreak, just good times and memories that both of us get to carry back to wherever we came from. It's not for everyone, but it works for me. I've never been the guy who wants to settle down. And the thought of being a father, well, let's just say that's not on my bucket list. That's why I took care of things early on. And I haven't looked back. I'm healthy, in good shape, and I enjoy my life. I know people talk, I know people judge, but I don't really care. I've chosen this life, and I'm happy with it. My sister, though, she's had a very different experience. Sarah got pregnant during her gap year, one wild night, one bad decision, and everything changed. She had to put off college. And suddenly she was a single mother, raising Maddie all by herself after the guy who got her pregnant disappeared. It wasn't easy for her, for years. She struggled just to keep her head above water. I know she loves Maddie, he's a good kid, but she can't hide the fact that becoming a mother so young derailed her entire life. She's doing better now, they're both doing okay. But it wasn't always like that. I watched her go through hell. And even though we don't talk about it much, I know she still carries a lot of regret. I think that's part of the reason she can't stand my lifestyle. It's like my freedom is a reminder of what she gave up. Maybe that's why, every time we see each other, she ends up criticizing my choices. She says I'm selfish, that I don't understand what it means to care about someone else, that I'm wasting my life. She doesn't get that it's not about avoiding responsibility for me. It's about creating a life where I can fully enjoy every moment without feeling trapped. And maybe it's hard for her to accept that because her life feels like the exact opposite. I get it, though. Her life's been hard, and she's had to fight for everything. In her eyes, I'm the younger brother who got away with everything. I went to college right out of high school, traveled the world, and built a business while she was stuck raising a kid on her own. She didn't get the same chance to chase her dreams. And I think that's where a lot of the tension between us comes from. She's still angry at the guy who abandoned her. Angry at how her life turned out. And sometimes, I think, angry at me for not having to deal with the same struggles. It's been a long time since I've spent much time with my family. I fly back to Calgary every so often, usually for the holidays, but I've been living in Central America for almost a decade now. I'm a visitor in their world. And honestly, I like it that way. It's nice to see them, sure, but I always feel like I'm on the outside looking in. I don't quite fit into the life they have here, family dinners, holiday traditions, the whole routine. It's just not for me. But every time I come back, I can see the lines deepening on my parents' faces, the gray creeping into their hair. And I realize that time is moving forward whether I'm there to see it or not. My sister and I may not agree on a lot of things. But we're still family. And for better or worse, family is always there, even when you've chosen to live a life as far from them as possible. Now, I'm back in Calgary for Canadian Thanksgiving, sitting around the same table where I spent so many dinners as a kid. My parents, my sister, and Maddie, they're all here. And I can feel the tension in the air already. It's been building for years. This unspoken rift between me and my sister. We both know it's there, but we've never really addressed it head on. And today, I have a feeling it's going to boil over. I know she doesn't like the way I live my life. She thinks I'm irresponsible, that I treat women like disposable playthings, that I'm setting a bad example for Maddie. But what she doesn't understand is that I'm not like the guy who left her. I'm not making promises I can't keep. I'm not leaving behind any broken hearts or unwanted pregnancies. I've made my choices, and I live with them, fully aware of what they mean. I'm not ashamed of it. Still, I can feel it coming, the conversation that's going to blow everything wide open. And I'm not sure if this time, I'll be able to brush it off like I usually do. I've never apologized for my life, and I'm not about to start now. But something tells me that today, things are going to change. Thanksgiving at my parents' place has always been a quiet, predictable affair. The same familiar smells, roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, fill the house. And my mom scurries around, making sure everything's just right. My dad's in his usual spot in front of the TV, watching football, only half engaged in the conversation that swirls around him. It's comforting, in a way, to come back to this, even if it feels like stepping into someone else's life for a while. But this time, there's a tension in the air that's hard to ignore. I can feel it building, the way the temperature in a room shifts before a storm rolls in. And I know exactly where it's coming from, Sarah. It starts small, with the usual polite conversation. We're sitting around the dinner table, passing plates and making small talk about the weather, about how quickly the year has flown by. Maddie, now 19, is talking about his classes and what he's planning to do over the summer. My parents are mostly nodding along, offering the same gentle encouragement they always do. I'm trying to stay in the background, keeping my contributions to the conversation as light as possible. But I can feel my sister's eyes on me, waiting for an opening. So, Sarah says, her voice just a little too sharp to be casual. How's life in paradise? I know where this is going. She's asked me this question 100 times before, always with that same undertone of judgment, as if the life I've built is somehow less real than the one she's been forced to live. But I play along, taking a sip of my wine and leaning back in my chair. Pretty good, actually, I say with a smile. Business has been great. We're getting more tourists now that travel restrictions have lifted. So I've been busy, but still finding time for the usual, diving, kayaking, all the fun stuff. Sarah's mouth tightens, and I can see the irritation flash across her face. Must be nice, she says, her words clipped. Just living the dream, huh? No responsibilities, no commitments. Sounds like a real fairy tale. And there it is, the opening shot. I could deflect, steer the conversation back to something neutral. But I'm tired of playing that game. She's been simmering with resentment for years, and I'm done pretending I don't notice. So instead, I shrug, keeping my voice even. It works for me, I say. I've built a life I enjoy. Isn't that what we're all supposed to do? Sarah lets out a short, bitter laugh, setting her fork down with a clatter. Sure, if that's what you want to call it. But some of us don't get to just pick up and run away whenever we feel like it. Some of us have actual responsibilities. I glance at my parents, who are both staring at their plates, clearly uncomfortable. Maddie's looking between us, wide-eyed, not sure where this is going but probably sensing the tension. 2. He's always admired me, and I can tell by the look on his face that he doesn't want to see this turn into a fight. I should back down, I should let it go. But something about the way Sarah's looking at me, the way she's always looked at me like I'm some selfish, carefree child who never had to grow up, gets under my skin. I didn't run away, I say, keeping my tone measured. I made a choice, just like you made a choice to keep Maddie. We all make decisions about what we want our lives to look like. It's not about running away. Sarah's eyes flash with anger, and I can see the words forming on her lips before she even speaks them. I didn't have a choice. She snaps. I got pregnant. I was abandoned. I had to grow up and take responsibility for another human being while you were off living your carefree, perfect life. I feel the weight of her words hit me. And for a second, I almost feel guilty. Almost. But then I remind myself that her situation and mine are completely different. She's angry at the world. At the guy who left her. At the way her life turned out. And I've become her scapegoat because my life doesn't fit into her narrative of what adulthood should look like. I'm not the guy who abandoned you. I say quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't cause your problems. And just because I've chosen a different path doesn't mean I don't understand what responsibility is. Sarah shakes her head, her hands trembling as she picks up her glass of water. You don't get it, she mutters. You'll never get it. You go off and do whatever you want, living in your little fantasy world, while the rest of us had to deal with reality. And now Maddie wants to be just like you. That last sentence hangs in the air, heavy and sharp, and I can see my parents shift uncomfortably. Maddie looks embarrassed, shrinking back in his chair. But I can't let this slide. If Maddie wants to explore the world, I don't see the problem with that, I say, turning toward my nephew, trying to keep things from spiraling out of control. He's young. He should be figuring out what he wants out of life. Sarah's face turns red, her voice rising. You think it's that simple, don't you? Just pack up and go have fun. But it's not. I'm trying to make sure he doesn't end up like you, floating through life without any real direction, without thinking about the consequences. You might be okay with being the guy women regret, but I'm not letting my son turn into that. The room goes silent. Even my dad, who's usually oblivious to the family drama, looks up from his plate, clearly sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I feel my chest tighten. The words hang there, sharp and cutting. The guy women regret. It's not the first time I've heard something like that. But coming from my sister, it stings more than I expected. I don't promise anyone anything. I'm clear about what I want and what I don't. No lies, no broken promises, no pregnancies. But somehow, I'm still the bad guy. I take a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. But I can feel the frustration bubbling up. I'm not the one who left you with a kid, I say, my voice calm but firm. I don't make promises I can't keep. And I'm not stringing anyone along. I live my life honestly. If people regret our time together, that's on them, not me. Sarah slams her hand on the table, the sound startling everyone. You don't get it, she shouts, her voice cracking. You think just because you didn't get anyone pregnant that makes you better than him? You're just as selfish as he was. You use people, you toss them aside, and then you act like you're the victim when someone calls you out on it. I glance at Maddie, who's looking at me with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. I don't want him to see this, to get dragged into this mess. But there's no way to avoid it now. I'm not using anyone, I say, turning back to Sarah. I don't lie to people. I don't promise them anything. They know what they're getting into. And they leave when it's over. There's no betrayal, no abandonment. It's just life. Sarah shakes her head, tears welling up in her eyes. You're exactly like him, she whispers, her voice broken. You just don't want to admit it. For a moment, I don't know what to say. The words hit harder than I expected. And I realize that this fight isn't really about me. It's about her past, about the pain she's still carrying from what happened with Maddie's father. About the life she feels like she never got to live because of that one decision. I'm not him, Sarah, I say quietly, my voice softer now. I've made my choices, and I live with them. But I didn't abandon anyone. I didn't hurt anyone. Sarah doesn't respond. She just looks down at her plate, her shoulders slumped, and for a second, I feel a wave of guilt wash over me. Maybe I am selfish. Maybe I've spent so much time running from responsibility that I don't even see the damage I've left behind. But I can't be the guy she blames for everything. I won't be. The silence stretches on, heavy and uncomfortable. My parents don't say anything, but I can tell they're both disappointed. They wanted a nice, quiet Thanksgiving. And now it's been ruined by yet another fight between their two kids. Maddie clears his throat, breaking the silence. I think I'm gonna go for a walk, he says awkwardly, standing up from the table. I watch him go, and for a moment, I wonder if maybe Sarah's right. Maybe he does see me as someone to emulate. And maybe that's not such a good thing after all. Thanksgiving dinner was over, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud hanging low over the house. After the argument, Sarah had disappeared into the guest bedroom. Maddie had gone for his walk. and my parents were cleaning up in the kitchen in awkward silence. I stayed in the dining room, staring down at the remnants of dinner, the half-empty wine glasses, and the uneaten slices of pumpkin pie. It wasn't like this was the first time Sarah and I had clashed. But this felt different. Her words, comparing me to the guy who had left her, accusing me of being selfish, of being the kind of man women regretted, kept replaying in my head. And for the first time, I couldn't just brush it off. I don't regret the choices I've made in my life. But hearing it all laid out like that, hearing my sister call me selfish, hit harder than I expected. Maybe it was because she was speaking from a place of such deep hurt. A place I hadn't fully understood before. Or maybe it was because I was starting to wonder if there was a grain of truth in her accusations. I had built my life to avoid exactly what she'd gone through: unexpected pregnancies, broken relationships, the crushing weight of responsibility. I had spent years making sure my life was free of complications, that no one could accuse me of being careless. But now I was starting to wonder if, in my quest to avoid hurting anyone, I had somehow missed the fact that maybe I was still causing pain. I pushed my chair back from the table, the sound of the legs scraping against the floor jarring in the quiet room. I needed air, space to think. Grabbing my jacket from the back of the chair, I headed out the front door and into the cold evening. The crisp air hit me immediately, the sharp chill cutting through my thoughts and offering a brief moment of clarity. The streets were quiet, and the sky was already dark, the stars just beginning to peek through the clouds. I shoved my hands in my pockets and started walking, not really sure where I was going, just needing to move. I didn't want to think about the argument, but I couldn't stop replaying it in my head, each word like a small hammer tapping away at my defenses. I thought about Matty, how he'd looked at me when the fight started, how he'd left the table without a word. He'd always looked up to me, admired the life I had built, but now I wasn't sure if I was the kind of role model he needed. Sarah's words had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had been too quick to dismiss her concerns. Maybe she was right to worry about Matty following in my footsteps. I walked for a while, the cold seeping into my bones, but I didn't care. The fresh air helped clear my head, and the more I walked, the more I began to see things from Sarah's perspective. She wasn't angry at me for living my life the way I had. She was angry because, in her eyes, I had managed to avoid all the consequences that she had been forced to face. She had made one mistake, a mistake that had changed the entire course of her life, and now she was terrified that Matty would make the same mistake. And in her mind, I was the embodiment of everything that could go wrong. I didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of me that felt guilty. I had been so focused on living my own life, on enjoying my freedom, that I hadn't really stopped to think about the impact it might have on the people around me, on my family, on Matty, even on the women I dated. Sure, I didn't lie to anyone, and I didn't make promises I couldn't keep, but maybe there was more to it than that. Maybe just being honest wasn't enough. By the time I made my way back to the house, the lights were still on, and I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation coming from inside. I hesitated at the front door, wondering if I should just slip back into the guest room and avoid any more confrontations for the night. But before I could decide, the door opened, and there was Matty, standing on the porch with his hands shoved in his pockets, looking just as unsure as I felt. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him out onto the porch. We stood there for a moment in silence, neither of us knowing what to say. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he was shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he was trying to figure out how to start a conversation he didn't really want to have. "I didn't mean for all that to happen," I said, breaking the silence. "I know your mom is worried about you. She just wants what's best." Matty nodded, but he didn't say anything right away. He looked down at his shoes, his shoulders hunched against the cold. "Yeah," he muttered finally, "but it's not like I'm planning on screwing up my life or anything. I want to figure things out on my own." I nodded, understanding exactly where he was coming from. I'd felt the same way when I was his age, itching to get out into the world and make my own decisions, free from anyone else's expectations. "You're allowed to want that," I said, "but your mom's scared. She doesn't want you to make the same mistakes she did. It's not that she doesn't trust you. She just knows how quickly things can change." Matty sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "I know. But it feels like she's always waiting for me to mess up. Like she's already decided that I'm going to make the wrong choice. No matter what. I didn't have an easy answer for him. I couldn't tell him that things would get better with Sarah or that she'd suddenly start trusting him completely. But I could at least help him see things from her side. She loves you, Maddie, I said quietly. She's been through a lot. And sometimes that makes it hard for her to let go. But she wants you to have a better life than she did. That's all any parent wants. He nodded, but I could tell he was still frustrated. And who could blame him? At 19, all you want is freedom. And it's hard to see the fear and worry behind your parents' actions when you're feeling suffocated by their expectations. I know I'm not exactly the role model your mom wants for you, I said after a moment, choosing my words carefully. And maybe she's right to be worried. But you're smart. You'll figure out your own path. Maddie looked at me then, his expression softening. I don't think you're a bad role model, he said, his voice sincere. I don't know. I think maybe I want the kind of life you have. But I'm not sure if I can handle it. I smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. My life isn't perfect, Maddie. It looks good from the outside. But it's not all adventure and fun. It can be lonely sometimes. And I've made sacrifices, things I'll probably never have. Like a family or a home base. There are trade-offs. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't quite ready to understand what I was saying. It would take time, and maybe some of his own mistakes, for him to really see the bigger picture. We stood there for a while longer, not saying much, just letting the cold air clear our heads. I could tell Maddie was thinking, processing everything that had happened tonight. And I hoped that, at the very least, he'd feel like he could talk to me about it when he was ready. Come on, I said after a while, clapping him on the shoulder. Let's go back inside before we freeze out here. Maddie gave a small smile and followed me back into the warmth of the house. I knew the night wasn't over. And there were still plenty of unresolved feelings between me and Sarah. But for now, I felt a little more at peace. Things were messy, sure, but maybe that was just part of being a family. Maybe it was okay that we didn't have all the answers right away. As I headed toward the guest room, I caught a glimpse of Sarah in the hallway. She didn't say anything, but our eyes met for a brief moment. And in that moment, I could see the exhaustion and frustration in her face. But I could also see something else. Something that looked like a small, tentative step toward understanding. Maybe things weren't completely broken between us after all. The morning after the blow-up, the house felt quieter, like everyone was walking on eggshells. We hadn't resolved much during dinner the night before, but the emotional hangover lingered. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen drifted down the hall. And I took that as a signal to get up and face whatever the day had in store. As I made my way into the kitchen, I saw my sister sitting at the table, staring down at a mug of coffee. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept much. Which was probably true. I knew she'd spent half the night in her room, likely replaying the fight, just as I had. We'd both said things that stung, and I figured the sting hadn't worn off yet for either of us. She didn't look up as I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. The table between us feeling like a physical divide. We didn't say anything at first. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence from the night before. It felt more like a pause. Like both of us were waiting to see who would speak first. I shouldn't have said what I did last night, Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was still an edge to it. Like she was trying to keep her emotions in check. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to shrug it off. Tell her it was no big deal. That I didn't take it personally. But the truth was, I did. I couldn't pretend her words hadn't hit home. And I didn't want to dismiss her apology either. It wasn't easy for Sarah to admit when she was wrong. And I knew this was as close as I get to an olive branch. I shouldn't have said some of the things I said either, I replied, keeping my tone soft. I wasn't trying to make you feel like your life doesn't matter or anything like that. I know you've been through a lot, Sarah, more than I probably understand. She glanced up at me then. Her eyes tired but less angry than they'd been last night. I get so frustrated sometimes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like, I look at my life. And then I look at yours. And it's hard not to feel like I missed out on everything. Like I made one mistake. And now I'm stuck in this life I didn't choose. Her words hung in the air. And I realized that this wasn't just about last night or even about Maddie. This was about something much deeper. Something that had been festering inside her for years. Sarah had always been the responsible one, the one who had everything planned out. She'd been on track for a bright future, college, a career, maybe even a family, but all of that changed when she got pregnant. I remember how terrified she was when she told our parents, her hands shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. The guy who got her pregnant, Maddie's dad, disappeared before the ink was even dry on the pregnancy test. And just like that, Sarah's entire world shifted. I hadn't fully understood it back then. I was still a teenager myself, more interested in my own future than in the realities of what she was going through. But now, looking at her across the table, I could see just how much weight she was carrying. You didn't choose this life. I know, I said quietly, but you've done an amazing job raising Maddie. He's a good kid, and that's because of you. Sarah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. It doesn't feel that way sometimes. It feels like I've just been trying to survive, trying to keep things together, while everything else falls apart. I didn't know what to say. How could I? I hadn't been there. Not really. Sure, I visited when I could, but I hadn't lived through the day-to-day grind she'd endured. Trying to raise a kid on her own while also figuring out how to support herself. I hadn't been there for the sleepless nights, the stress of bills piling up, the guilt of wondering if she was doing enough for Maddie. I had been living my life on my own terms, while she had been sacrificing everything for someone else. I get it, though, she continued, her voice a little stronger now. I get why you did what you did, getting the vasectomy. Moving away, avoiding all the stuff that tied me down. I get it, I really do. Sometimes I wish I'd had that option. But I didn't, and I've had to live with that. I sat there, absorbing her words. I knew she wasn't looking for pity, and I wasn't going to offer any. But I did feel something close to guilt. Not because I had made different choices, but because I hadn't fully appreciated what those choices meant for her. For years, I had been so focused on my own freedom that I hadn't really taken the time to see how much Sarah had given up. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, I said, choosing my words carefully, but I do know that you've had it harder than I ever did. And I'm sorry if my life feels like a slap in the face sometimes. Sarah looked at me, her eyes softening. It's not your fault. You know, I don't blame you for what happened to me. I'm just tired. I'm tired of feeling like everything I do is for someone else. Like I'm never going to get to live the life I wanted. And when I see you living the way you do, it just reminds me of all the things I don't have. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. I hadn't realized just how deep her resentment went. But now that she was laying it all out in front of me, it made sense. She wasn't angry at me. Not really. She was angry at the life she had been forced into. She was angry at the way her choices had been taken away from her. While I had the luxury of making my own, we sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything we hadn't said to each other over the years settling between us. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt necessary, like we were finally getting to the root of the tension that had been simmering between us for so long. I think I've always been jealous of you, Sarah admitted after a while, her voice barely audible. You've always done whatever you wanted, without worrying about anyone else. And I've spent so much time thinking about how different my life could have been if things had gone the way I planned. I wasn't sure how to respond. I hadn't expected her to say that. Jealous? Of me? It didn't seem possible. I'd always seen her as the strong one, the one who had everything together, even in the face of all the challenges life threw at her. I hadn't considered that maybe she saw me as the one who had it all figured out. Jealous of me? I repeated, surprised. I've always thought you were the one who had the tough job. Raising Maddie and making it work. Sarah shrugged. It hasn't been easy, but I guess when you don't have a choice, you just keep going. There was a heaviness to her words, and I could see how much she had internalized that mindset, just keep going. She had lived through so much, and it wasn't until now that I really saw how much it had cost her. The years of being a single mother, of sacrificing her own dreams for the sake of her son, of constantly putting herself last. It was all catching up to her, and I could see it in the way she held herself, the way she talked about her life. I know it's not much, I said slowly, but if you ever need a break, if you ever need time for yourself, you can always count on me. I'll be here for Maddie. Or whatever you need. Sarah looked at me, her expression softening. Thanks, she said quietly. I appreciate that, but I don't know if I even remember what taking a break feels like. I laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension. Well, whenever you're ready to find out. I'm here. The conversation drifted after that, but there was a sense of understanding between us that hadn't been there before. We weren't going to fix everything in one morning, but it felt like we had finally opened the door to a real conversation, one that had been a long time coming. As I finished my coffee, I glanced over at Sarah, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I understood her a little better. She wasn't just my older sister, the one who had always seemed so strong and in control. She was a person who had faced incredible challenges, who had given up so much for her son, and who, despite everything, was still trying to make it all work. It didn't change the fact that our lives had taken completely different paths. But it did make me appreciate her more. I saw the weight she carried, and while I couldn't take that weight away from her, I could at least acknowledge it. For the first time, I realized that being free, as I had always defined it, came with its own costs. And Sarah, in her own way, had made sacrifices I couldn't even begin to imagine. Later that day, after the conversation with Sarah, I found myself sitting on the porch, staring out at the quiet suburban street where we grew up. It was strange being back here. Every time I returned, I felt like a visitor in a life that had moved on without me. My sister's frustrations and sacrifices had made that all too clear. But there was something else hanging in the air now. Something that I couldn't shake. Matty. He was a good kid. Smart and thoughtful, but still young enough to be captivated by the idea of escaping the ordinary life. And I knew why. It wasn't just the allure of traveling or living on the beach. It was about something more. The promise of freedom, of control over your own destiny, was intoxicating, especially for someone like him, who had watched his mother struggle and sacrifice for years. I could tell he saw something in my life that felt like the opposite of what he had grown up around. He'd seen Sarah scrape by, doing everything she could to provide for him, and he wanted out, wanted to avoid the kind of traps he thought had consumed her life. I knew that feeling well. When I was his age, I'd wanted the same thing, and I'd done whatever it took to make sure I didn't end up feeling tied down by anything or anyone. As I sat there, I heard the door creak open behind me, and Matty stepped outside. He looked unsure of himself, shoving his hands into his pockets as he walked over to where I was sitting. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the street like I was. "Hey," I said after a moment, breaking the silence. "Hey," he replied, still looking away. I knew why he was out here. I could feel the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us, about his mom, about me, about the future he was trying to figure out for himself. I didn't want to push him to talk, but I knew he couldn't avoid the conversation forever. He was at a crossroads, and I had a feeling that, in some way, he was waiting for me to help him make sense of it all. "You've been thinking a lot about what your mom said, huh?" I asked, keeping my tone light but open. Matty nodded, his eyes still fixed on the street ahead. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I mean, she's always worried about me. But it feels like this time it's different. She really doesn't want me to end up like him." He hesitated for a moment, then corrected himself. "Like you." I winced inwardly, but I knew it wasn't a direct insult. He was just trying to figure out where I fit into the picture his mom had painted for him. I could hear the conflict in his voice, the way he was torn between admiration and doubt. And honestly, I understood it. Sarah had her reasons for being protective, but I couldn't deny that my lifestyle probably looked reckless from where she was standing. "I get it," I said. "Your mom wants what's best for you. She doesn't want you to make the same mistakes she did." Matty nodded again, still not meeting my eyes. "It's just, I don't know. I feel like I've been living my whole life by her rules. She's had to be so strict because, well, you know, it's always been just the two of us. And she's always been in survival mode, trying to make sure I don't mess up like she thinks she did." He paused, finally glancing over at me. "But that's not the life I want. I don't want to be stuck like she is." There it was, the heart of it all. Matty wasn't just looking for an escape, he was looking for a life that felt like it belonged to him. One where he didn't have to follow the path his mom had laid out. And as much as Sarah loved him, her fear of him making the same mistakes she had made it impossible for her to see that he wasn't a little boy anymore. He was a young man, and he needed the chance to figure things out for himself. "I understand," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I felt the same way when I was your age. I wanted to get out, to find my own way, to live a life that was different from what everyone expected." Matty looked at me, his expression softening a little. Yeah, that's it exactly. I mean, I'm not saying I don't love mom or anything like that. I do. I want to see what else is out there. You know? I nodded. Of course. And you should. You're young. You've got time to figure out what you want from life. No one should be telling you that you have to have it all figured out right now. He sighed, pushing his hands deeper into his pockets. That's the thing, though. Mom's always telling me that if I don't make the right decisions now, I'll regret it later. That I need to focus on school, get a good job, and do things the right way. I chuckled softly. That sounds like Sarah. Maddie managed a small smile. Yeah, I guess so. The silence stretched between us again. But it felt different this time, like we were both thinking through the next steps. I knew he admired my lifestyle. And I could tell he was trying to figure out how he could have that kind of freedom without letting his mom down. It was a tough place to be. And I didn't envy him. Look, I said finally, leaning forward, your mom loves you, and she's doing her best. She's afraid because she knows how quickly life can change. And yeah, she's right to be cautious. But that doesn't mean you have to live your life according to her rules forever. You're allowed to want different things. Maddie frowned, looking conflicted. Yeah, but she's made so many sacrifices for me. I feel like I owe it to her to at least try to follow the plan. You know, I get that, I said softly. But her sacrifices don't mean you have to give up on your own dreams. You can honor what she's done for you while still making your own choices. He was quiet for a while. His eyes focused on the horizon. Do you ever feel like you missed out on anything? Like, not having a family or settling down? The question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to answer. I'd spent so much of my life avoiding the things that most people saw as milestones, marriage, kids, a mortgage, that I hadn't really stopped to think about whether I missed them. Sure, there were moments when I wondered what life would have been like if I'd taken a different path. But regret? I wasn't sure if that was the right word. I don't regret the choices I've made, I said after a moment. I love my life. I love the freedom I have, the experiences I've had, but yeah, sometimes I think about what it would have been like to have a family. There are trade-offs, Maddie. No matter what you choose, there's always going to be something you didn't do. But that doesn't mean you've made the wrong choice. Maddie seemed to mull that over. His brow furrowed in thought. So, you don't think I'd be throwing my life away if I didn't follow the safe path? I smiled. I think you need to figure out what matters to you. The safe path works for some people. And it's great if that's what they want. But if you're someone who needs more adventure, more freedom, then you need to honor that. Otherwise, you're just living someone else's dream. Maddie looked at me, his eyes wide with understanding. I think that's what I've been afraid of. Living someone else's life. We sat there for a while longer. The quiet settling around us as the conversation drifted in and out. I didn't have all the answers for him, but I could see that he was starting to piece things together for himself. He didn't want to disappoint his mom, but he also didn't want to live a life that didn't feel like his own. I'd love to have you come down to Central America, I said finally. You know, if you want, I could show you the ropes. Let you see what that kind of life is really like. But I don't want you to think you have to be like me. You've got to find your own way. Maddie smiled, a genuine smile this time. I'd like that, but I've got to figure some stuff out first. I nodded. Take your time. You don't have to rush into anything. As Maddie stood up to head back inside, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. He was struggling, sure, but he was also thinking deeply about what he wanted from life. He wasn't just looking for an easy escape, he was searching for meaning. For a way to carve out his own identity in the world. I watched him walk back into the house. And for the first time in a while, I felt a little more hopeful about the future, his and mine. That night, long after Maddie had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, I lay awake, staring up at the ceiling, my mind churning with everything that had happened over the past few days. Sarah's accusations, Maddie's questions, even my own thoughts. Everything seemed to swirl together, leaving me restless and unable to sleep. For years, I had lived my life exactly the way I wanted to. No obligations, no attachments, no compromises. It had worked for me. But now, for the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering if there was something I was missing, if maybe Sarah's words had hit a little closer to home than I wanted to admit. I'd always told myself that I wasn't like the guys who left women high and dry. Who made promises they didn't keep? Who walked away when things got complicated? I wasn't leaving any messes behind. The women I met on vacation or during brief flings knew what they were signing up for, no strings. No commitments. Just a good time. And it wasn't like I'd lied about it. I was clear from the start. But now, I found myself wondering if just being honest about what I didn't want was enough. I thought about some of the women I'd been with over the years, flashes of faces. Brief encounters that had come and gone. Sometimes in the span of a few days. Sometimes over the course of a few weeks. We had fun. Sure, we laughed, shared stories, enjoyed the sun, the sea, and the freedom of living in the moment. But then they always left. And I stayed behind, as if nothing had ever really happened. Had I ever thought about how they felt afterward? Did they regret it, the way Sarah suggested? Did they look back on their time with me as a mistake? As something they wished they could erase? I'd never considered that before. Because in my mind, everything was mutual. No one was getting hurt. But was that true? Or was I just telling myself that to feel better about the way I lived my life? I sighed, rubbing my eyes and sitting up in bed. The house was dark, and the only sound was the soft hum of the heater kicking on. It was late, probably after midnight, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. I felt like I was on the edge of something. A realization that I wasn't ready to fully embrace. It wasn't just about the women I dated. It was about the way I'd structured my entire life. For years, I had believed that my freedom, my ability to live without anyone else's expectations weighing me down, was the key to happiness. I had built my life around avoiding the kind of commitments that most people saw as necessary. I had convinced myself that settling down, starting a family, getting tied to one place, all of that was the enemy of true happiness. But now I wasn't so sure. Sarah had made sacrifices. Yes, but hadn't I made sacrifices too? In choosing freedom, I had given up on stability. I had traded the potential for deep, lasting relationships for the thrill of short-term encounters. I had chosen adventure over roots. And while I didn't regret those choices, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of me, one that I had buried deep down, that wondered what life might look like if I had made different decisions. I got up from the bed and made my way to the kitchen. My bare feet padding softly on the cold hardwood floor. I poured myself a glass of water, leaning against the counter as I stared out the window into the dark. Quiet street. The neighborhood was still. Everyone tucked away in their homes, living lives that probably looked nothing like mine. There was a time when I would have looked at this scene and felt smug. Proud that I had escaped the suburban grind, the 9 to 5, the endless cycle of responsibility. But now, I wasn't so sure. Was there something to be said for the kind of life I had always avoided? A life where you belonged to someone, where you built something together, where your decisions weren't just about you but about the people you cared about. The thought of it made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to questioning myself like this. I had always been so sure that I was doing what was right for me. That my choices were the ones that would lead to the most fulfillment. But Sarah's anger, Maddie's admiration, even my parents' quiet disappointment, it all made me wonder if I had been too narrow in my thinking. Maybe there was more to life than just chasing freedom. I thought about Maddie's questions earlier. Did I ever feel like I missed out on anything? I had given him the answer that felt true at the time, no regrets. No longing for a different life. But now, standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night, I wasn't so sure. Maybe I hadn't let myself think too hard about the things I might have missed. It was easier that way. It was easier to stay focused on the benefits of the life I had chosen, rather than to think about the things I'd never have. Like a family, I'd made sure that would never happen. I'd had a vasectomy at 20, and I was certain I didn't want kids. But was that a decision I'd made out of genuine desire? Or was it something I had done because I was afraid of what that kind of responsibility would mean? Was I afraid of becoming the kind of man who abandoned his child, the way Maddie's father had? Was I afraid of becoming the kind of man who hurt people because I didn't know how to be there for them? I swallowed. My throat dry despite the water. The weight of these thoughts felt unfamiliar. Like I was walking through a part of my mind that I hadn't explored in years. Maybe ever. I wasn't unhappy. That much I knew. I loved my life in Central America. The business I had built with my friend. The adventures I had every day. But now, I was starting to wonder if happiness was the only thing that mattered. Was there more? Was there something deeper that I had been missing because I was too afraid to look for it? I thought about Sarah again. About the life she'd had to lead. I had always seen her as stuck, trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. But maybe there was something I hadn't considered, maybe. In the sacrifices she'd made. She had found a sense of purpose that I didn't have. Sure, her life wasn't the one she had planned. But Maddie was the center of her world. And there was something undeniably beautiful about that kind of love. I had never let myself get close enough to anyone to feel that kind of connection. And now I was beginning to realize that maybe, in my pursuit of total freedom, I had missed out on one of the most important parts of life. The part where you let people in. Where you make yourself vulnerable. Where you allow yourself to be part of something bigger than just your own desires. I leaned against the counter, staring into the darkness, my thoughts a tangled mess. I didn't know what to do with all of this yet. I wasn't ready to change everything about the way I lived my life. But I also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about what true freedom meant. Maybe real freedom wasn't about avoiding responsibility. Maybe it was about choosing the kind of responsibilities that gave your life meaning. I took another sip of water, trying to clear my head, but the questions kept swirling. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have all the answers. And as uncomfortable as that was, it also felt like the beginning of something important, something I wasn't ready to fully understand yet but knew I couldn't ignore. The sun would be up soon, and the house would stir with life again. But for now, in the quiet of the night, I let myself sit with the uncertainty, knowing that, for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what my next step would be. The morning after my sleepless night, I woke up feeling heavier, like the weight of all my thoughts from the night before hadn't left me. It was strange, this unfamiliar feeling of uncertainty. I had always been so sure of my choices, my path, but now, there was this lingering doubt, this nagging question. Had I missed something along the way? I could hear the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen, a sound that signaled Sarah was already up, probably cleaning or doing something to keep herself busy. She always needed to be moving, always needed to feel like she was accomplishing something. That was one of the ways we were different. I could let time pass without feeling guilty. But for her, every second had to be filled with purpose. Maybe that was one of the side effects of becoming a single mother so young. There wasn't any room in her life for idle moments. I got out of bed, pulled on a hoodie, and made my way to the kitchen, not quite sure what kind of mood I'd find her in. After the intensity of the past few days, I was ready for anything, another argument, a quiet apology, or maybe just silence. But as I stepped into the room, I saw her standing by the sink, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read. She didn't look angry or frustrated, just distant. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for her to notice me. I wasn't going to push her to talk, but there was a sense in the air that something was coming. Something that needed to be said. After a few moments, she turned away from the window and glanced over at me. There was a tiredness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed it. She walked over to the table and sat down across from me, folding her hands in front of her. "Do you ever think about what your life would be like if you'd made different choices?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her question caught me off guard. It wasn't what I'd expected. Not from her. Sarah had always seemed so sure of her own path, so focused on making things work for her and Maddie. But now, sitting there with her hands folded in front of her, she looked like someone who was carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to buy myself a little time to think. I'd spent all night wrestling with my own doubts. And now here she was, asking me the very question I'd been asking myself. Sometimes, I admitted finally, I don't regret the choices I've made. But yeah, I wonder what things would have been like if I'd taken a different path. Sarah nodded, but she didn't say anything for a moment. She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "I didn't plan for any of this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan to become a mother at 20. I didn't plan to give up on college or to spend the next 2 decades of my life scraping by just to make sure Maddie had what he needed. And sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't gotten pregnant. If I hadn't made that one mistake." There was a rawness in her voice that I hadn't heard before. A vulnerability that made me feel like I was intruding on something private. Something she had kept hidden for years. I had known, on some level, that Sarah regretted the way her life had turned out. But I had never heard her say it out loud. And now, hearing her admit it, I realized just how much she had buried beneath the surface. "I love Maddie," she continued, her voice trembling. I don't regret having him. But I regret what it did to me. To my life. I regret how much I had to give up. And sometimes I feel like I lost myself in all of it. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I had spent so much time defending my own choices. My own freedom. That I had never stopped to really think about what Sarah had lost in the process of raising Maddie on her own. Sure, I had known she struggled. But hearing her lay it all out like this, hearing the pain in her voice, was different. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. I said softly, you had to grow up fast. And I don't think anyone could blame you for feeling like you missed out on something. Sarah let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Missed out on something? I missed out on everything. I watched all my friends go off to college, get their degrees, start their careers, and I was stuck at home with a baby, wondering how I was going to pay rent next month. I had to become an adult overnight, and I was completely alone. I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I knew I hadn't been there for her in the way she probably needed. I had been too focused on my own life, on my own escape, to really understand what she was going through. And now, years later, it was clear that she was still carrying the weight of those early sacrifices. You're not alone now, I said, trying to offer something, anything, that might make her feel less isolated in all of this. Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. I know that, but it doesn't change the fact that I feel like I lost a part of myself. The person I was supposed to be, the life I was supposed to have, it's gone. And I can never get it back. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had been focused on defending my own choices, on justifying my decision to live a life free of the responsibilities that Sarah had been forced to take on. But now, hearing her speak so honestly about her regrets, I realized that maybe I had been wrong to see her as just the responsible one. The one who had done what she had to do. Sarah hadn't wanted this life any more than I had wanted the life of a suburban dad. She had been dealt a hand she hadn't asked for, and she had done the best she could with it. But that didn't mean she hadn't lost something along the way. And maybe, just maybe, I had underestimated the depth of her loss. I can't pretend to know what it's been like for you, I said carefully, but I want you to know that I admire you. I really do. You've raised Maddie on your own. And he's a great kid. That's something to be proud of. Sarah looked at me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. I know, she whispered. I'm proud of him, but that doesn't make the regret go away. I nodded, understanding what she meant. Regret was a complicated thing. You could be proud of the choices you made, proud of the people you loved, and still feel the weight of what you had given up. It was possible to hold both at the same time, pride and sorrow. Love and regret. We sat in silence for a while. The only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I wanted to offer her something more, something that would make the pain go away. But I knew there was nothing I could say that would erase the years of struggle she had endured. But there was something else, something I hadn't considered before. Sarah wasn't just angry at me for living a life she couldn't. She was angry at herself, too, angry for the choices she had made, even though those choices had been the only ones available to her. She was angry at the universe, at fate, at whatever had conspired to take her life in a direction she hadn't planned for. And maybe, in some small way, she saw me as a reminder of the life she had lost. A life where freedom and adventure were still possible, where responsibilities didn't weigh her down. Maybe that's why she had been so harsh with me, why she had lashed out the way she had. I don't know if it helps, I said after a while, but you're not alone in feeling like you've missed out on something. I've spent my whole life chasing freedom, but now I'm starting to wonder if maybe I've missed out on something. Too, something deeper. Sarah looked at me, surprised. You? What could you have possibly missed out on? I shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed to admit it. I don't know. Maybe the chance to build something real with someone. Maybe the kind of love that lasts. I've always avoided it because I didn't want to feel tied down. But now I'm starting to wonder if I've been running away from something important. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression softening. Maybe we've both been running from something, she said finally. Me, from the life I thought I was supposed to have. And you, from the responsibilities that come with love and commitment. I nodded, realizing that maybe she was right. Maybe, in our own ways, we had both been running. And now, for the first time, we were both starting to see the things we had left behind. The rest of the day passed quietly after my conversation with Sarah. There was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Like we had finally reached an understanding, an acknowledgement of our shared regrets and the different ways we had both tried to navigate our lives. But even though things between Sarah and me felt a little lighter, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one more conversation I needed to have. Matty. I hadn't seen much of him since our talk on the porch. And I figured he was doing his best to avoid the tension that had built up between his mom and me. But I knew that avoiding it wasn't going to help him. He was on the verge of making big decisions about his future. And I wanted to make sure he wasn't feeling trapped or confused about what kind of life he should be chasing. I wanted him to understand that there was no single right way to live. No one path that guaranteed happiness or success. And more than anything, I wanted him to know that, no matter what he chose, he didn't have to follow in my footsteps or anyone else's. That evening, I found him sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in but didn't say anything right away. I could tell by the way he shifted in his seat that he was still thinking about our previous conversation. Still trying to figure things out for himself. I sat down on the couch across from him, the room feeling too big for the two of us and the unspoken tension that hung in the air. I wasn't great at these kinds of conversations, talking about feelings, about the future, but I knew I had to try. Matty deserved that. Hey, I said, breaking the silence. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation from the other day. About what you said. Matty looked up from his phone, his expression guarded but curious. Yeah, I continued. I know you're at a point where you're trying to figure out what you want from life. And I get that it's tough when there's pressure coming at you from different directions, especially from your mom and, well, maybe even from me. He frowned, sitting up a little straighter. I don't feel pressured by you, he said quickly. If anything, you're the one who makes me feel like there's more out there. That I don't have to do things the way everyone else does. I nodded, but there was a heaviness in my chest. I'm glad you feel that way. But I don't want you to think that my way is the only way to live. I know I've always talked about freedom, about not settling down, about avoiding responsibility, but I've been thinking a lot about that recently. And I'm starting to realize that there's more to life than just avoiding the things that scare you. Matty looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I sighed, trying to find the right words. I've spent most of my life running from the idea of commitment, whether it's relationships or a career or having a family. I convinced myself that being tied down would take away my freedom. That it would trap me in a life I didn't want. And for a long time, that worked for me. I've been able to live the way I wanted, without any real responsibilities. But now, I'm starting to wonder if I've been missing something. Matty leaned forward, clearly invested in what I was saying. Like what? Like connection, I said slowly. Like having something deeper in your life than just the next adventure. I've always valued my freedom. But I'm realizing that there's more to happiness than just living for yourself. You can have all the freedom in the world. But if you don't have people you care about, people who rely on you, who matter to you, it can feel empty. Matty was quiet, processing my words. But isn't that what you've always wanted? To be free, to not have to answer to anyone? I nodded. It was. And I don't regret living that way for the last decade. But that doesn't mean it's the only way to find happiness. What I'm trying to say is, I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between freedom and responsibility. You can find a balance. You can build a life that gives you both. He sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I get that, he said after a moment. But it's hard. Mom always talks about how important it is to follow the right path, college, a steady job, security, and I know she means well. But it feels like she's already decided what my life is supposed to look like. I could hear the frustration in his voice. And I understood it. Sarah had spent so many years trying to keep him safe. Trying to make sure he didn't make the same mistakes she had. That she had inadvertently put him in a box. And Matty, like anyone his age, was desperate to break out of it. You don't have to follow anyone's path but your own, I said, my voice firm but gentle. You're allowed to want something different. And yeah, your mom might not always understand that. But you have to trust yourself. You have to trust that you know what's right for you. He looked at me. And I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. But what if I don't know what's right for me? What if I make the wrong choice? I smiled. You're going to make mistakes. That's part of life. But you'll learn from them. And you don't have to have everything figured out right now. You're 19. You've got time to explore. To make mistakes. To figure out what you really want. Matty was quiet again, his eyes focused on the floor. I don't want to disappoint Mom, he said softly. She's done so much for me. And I know she wants me to have a better life than she had. I know, I said, my voice softening, and I think that's where a lot of her fear comes from. She's afraid that if you take risks, if you step outside the path she's laid out for you, you'll end up struggling the way she did. But what she doesn't realize is that you're not her. You're your own person, and your life doesn't have to mirror hers. He looked up at me, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen. So what do I do? How do I figure out what's right for me? I thought about it for a moment before answering. You start by listening to yourself, I said. What excites you? What makes you feel alive? What scares you in a good way? Follow those feelings. They'll lead you in the right direction. And don't be afraid to make choices that feel right for you, even if they don't make sense to everyone else. Matty nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through everything we had talked about. Do you really think I could come work with you? In Central America, I mean? I smiled, knowing that question was coming. Yeah, I think you could, but it's not going to be easy. And it's not all fun and games. Running a business is hard work, even when it's in a beautiful place. But if you're up for the challenge, I'd love to have you down there for a while. It might help you figure out what you really want. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him in days. I'd like that. I'd like to see what it's really like. Then let's make it happen, I said, feeling a surge of excitement. But no pressure. You've got time. And if you decide it's not for you, that's okay too. This is about you figuring out what's right for you. Matty leaned back in his chair, looking more at ease than he had in days. Thanks, Uncle, he said quietly. I needed to hear that. I nodded, feeling a sense of relief. The conversation hadn't been easy, but I was glad we'd had it. Matty was at a crossroads, and I wanted to make sure he felt supported, no matter what path he chose. As we sat there in comfortable silence, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for both of us. Maybe we didn't have all the answers, but we were figuring it out. And sometimes, that was enough. The next day, the house was quiet again, but there was a heaviness in the air. My conversation with Matty had left me feeling a little more at peace. But I knew things with Sarah still weren't settled. There was too much history, too much left unsaid, for us to just move forward without addressing the core issues between us. I found Sarah in the kitchen again, this time sitting at the table with her laptop open, probably answering work emails or managing one of the million other things she always had on her plate. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see the tension in her eyes. She knew, as well as I did, that there was unfinished business between us. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her, feeling the familiar discomfort of an impending conversation we both didn't really want to have but knew was necessary. Hey, I started, keeping my tone light but serious. I had a talk with Matty last night. Sarah looked up from her laptop, her expression immediately guarded. Yeah? What about? I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what I knew might be another tough conversation. We talked about his future, about the pressure he's been feeling, from both of us. She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. From both of us? I'm not the one telling him to run off to Central America and avoid responsibilities. There it was, her frustration, bubbling to the surface again. I wasn't surprised. Sarah had always been protective of Matty, and the idea of him choosing a life that didn't fit the mold she had imagined for him was clearly a sore spot. But I wasn't going to let this turn into another fight. Not this time. I'm not telling him to avoid responsibilities, I said calmly. I'm just trying to help him figure out what he wants. He's 19, Sarah. He's allowed to explore different paths, to make mistakes, to learn what kind of life he wants to live. Sarah sighed, closing her laptop and leaning back in her chair. You make it sound so easy. Like he can just go off and do whatever he wants and everything will magically work out. But that's not how life works. I know because I've lived it. One mistake, one bad decision, and everything can change. I could hear the fear in her voice, the way it tightened every word. She wasn't just worried about Matty's future, she was terrified. Terrified that he would end up like her. That he would make the same kind of mistake that had derailed her life all those years ago. I get that, I said, my voice softer now. I know you've been through a lot. I know you're scared that he's going to make a choice that he can't undo. But Sarah, he's not you. His life doesn't have to play out the way yours did. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with frustration. You don't understand. I've spent the last 19 years making sure he doesn't end up like me. I've given up everything, to make sure he has a better life. And now you come in here. With your stories about freedom and adventure. And he's looking at you like you're the answer. Like you have it all figured out. I winced at her words, feeling the sting of her accusation. She wasn't just angry, she was hurt. She felt like I was undoing everything she had worked so hard to protect. And I could see, for the first time, just how much pressure she had put on herself to be perfect. To be the parent who never let Maddie down. I'm not trying to take anything away from you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You've done an incredible job with Maddie. He's a smart, thoughtful kid, and that's because of you. But he's also his own person. He needs the space to figure out who he is. Even if that means making choices that scare you. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands clenching into fists on the table. You don't get it, she whispered. I've been afraid every day since he was born. Afraid that I wouldn't be enough. Afraid that I'd fail him. That I'd make the wrong choice and ruin his life the way I ruined mine. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always known Sarah was carrying a lot. But I hadn't realized just how deep her fear went. She wasn't just worried about Maddie's future. She was afraid of her own failure as a mother. Of repeating the same mistakes that had led to her own struggles. And now, with Maddie on the verge of adulthood, those fears were all coming to the surface. You didn't ruin your life, Sarah, I said gently. You made the best of a tough situation. And look at what you've done. You've raised a great kid. You've worked hard. You've given him everything you could. But you have to let him make his own choices now. You can't protect him from everything. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. And she blinked them away quickly. Clearly not wanting to break down in front of me. I don't know how, she admitted, her voice cracking. I don't know how to let go. I've spent so many years being his mom. Being the one who fixes everything. And now I don't know who I am without that. Her words hung in the air. And for the first time, I realized that Sarah wasn't just afraid of Maddie's choices. She was afraid of losing her own identity. Being Maddie's mom, being the one who held everything together, had been her entire life for nearly 2 decades. And now, with Maddie on the verge of independence, she was struggling to figure out who she was without that role. I know it's hard, I said softly, but you're more than just his mom. You've sacrificed so much, but you deserve to have a life that's yours too. You deserve to figure out what makes you happy, outside of being Maddie's protector. Sarah sniffed, wiping at her eyes. I don't even know where to start, she whispered. I've been so focused on him that I don't know how to do anything else. You start by letting him go a little, I said gently. You let him make his own choices. And you trust that you've given him the tools he needs to make the right ones. And then you figure out what you want. It's not too late, Sarah. It's never too late. She nodded, though I could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. What if he makes the wrong choice? She asked, her voice small. I smiled, trying to reassure her. He probably will. We all do at some point. But that's how we learn. You can't protect him from that. You can only be there for him when he needs you. Sarah let out a long breath, like she was releasing something that had been building up inside her for years. I know you're right, she said quietly. It's just hard to let go. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I know, but you're not alone. You've done an amazing job, Sarah. And Maddie's going to be okay. He's got you. And he's got me. We're both here for him. She squeezed my hand back, a small smile breaking through her tears. Thanks, she whispered. I'm sorry I've been so hard on you. I shook my head. Don't be. I know where it's coming from now. We've both been carrying a lot of weight for a long time. Sarah wiped at her eyes again, then sat up a little straighter. Maybe I'll talk to him tonight. About everything. About letting him figure things out. I smiled. I think that's a good idea. He's been waiting for that conversation. We sat in silence for a while. The tension between us finally starting to ease. For the first time in years. It felt like we were on the same page, both of us trying to figure out how to move forward. How to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. It wasn't going to be easy. But at least now, we were in it together. The evening after my conversation with Sarah, I found myself outside on the back porch again. The cool autumn air felt refreshing against my skin, a contrast to the weight of everything I'd been thinking about lately. The stars twinkled above, a reminder of how small we are in the grand scheme of things, how, for all the choices we make and the paths we take, the universe carries on regardless. I had always loved that about the night sky. It made everything feel less urgent, less consequential. But tonight, it couldn't take away the lingering thoughts that tugged at me. I sat there for a long time, replaying the conversations I'd had with Sarah and Maddie over the past few days. We'd said things that were hard to hear, harder to admit, but necessary. It was like a dam had finally broken, and now we were all just waiting to see where the floodwaters would take us. For the first time in years, I was allowing myself to think about my choices, not just in terms of what I wanted but in terms of what they meant for the people around me. I heard the door behind me open, and when I glanced back, I saw Maddie stepping outside. He didn't say anything at first, just came over and sat down next to me, hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. I knew he was still processing everything too, and I didn't want to rush him. Whatever was on his mind, he'd get to it in his own time. For a while, we just sat there in silence, looking up at the stars. It reminded me of when he was a kid, back when I'd still come to visit more regularly. I'd take him out at night, show him constellations, and tell him stories about faraway places. I guess, in some way, I'd always been planting seeds in his mind about a life beyond the suburban borders he'd grown up in. Maybe that was part of why he looked up to me the way he did. After a while, Maddie finally broke the silence. "Mom talked to me earlier," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded. "Yeah? How'd it go?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair and looking up at the sky. "It was good, I guess. She apologized for being so hard on me lately. She said she just wants to protect me from making the same mistakes she did." I could hear the weight of his words, the tension in them. Sarah's fears had been driving so much of their dynamic, but it was clear she was starting to let go, to trust that Maddie could find his own way. It was hard for her, but I was proud of her for taking that step. "She loves you, Maddie," I said gently. "She's always going to want what's best for you, even if it feels like she's putting too much pressure on you." "I know," he replied, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "It's just, I don't know. I feel like I'm stuck between what she wants for me and what I want for myself. And honestly, I'm not even sure what I want yet." I nodded, understanding exactly where he was coming from. I'd been in his shoes once, standing on the edge of adulthood, with the weight of everyone else's expectations pulling me in different directions. I didn't want to make things harder for him by pushing him to follow in my footsteps. But I also didn't want him to feel trapped by his mother's fears. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now," I said. "No one expects you to know exactly what you want at 19. You've got time, Maddie. Time to explore, to try different things, and even to make mistakes. That's how you figure it out." He glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but it's hard. Everyone's always talking about how important it is to make the right choices now, so you don't screw up your future. And I get that Mom doesn't want me to end up in a tough spot like she did. But I don't want to live in fear of messing up." I smiled, feeling a pang of recognition. I had lived my whole life avoiding the kind of commitments that might lead to the same kind of struggles Sarah had faced. And yet, here was Maddie, wrestling with that same fear from a different angle. Making the right choice doesn't mean avoiding every possible mistake, I said. It means making the choice that feels right for you. Even if you're not 100% sure about it, you're going to mess up sometimes. But that's part of life. And honestly, the only way to really screw up is to live someone else's version of your life instead of your own. Maddie stared at the ground for a moment, processing my words. "Do you think I'd be making the wrong choice if I came to work with you?" he asked. His voice hesitant. I could see that he was still struggling with the idea, torn between his curiosity about the life I'd built and the uncertainty of stepping away from the path his mother had laid out for him. He didn't want to disappoint anyone, least of all himself. "I think you'd be making the right choice if it's something you genuinely want to do," I said, "but only you can know that. I don't want you to come down there because you think my life is the one you should follow. I want you to come if you're curious, if you want to see what it's like. But if it doesn't feel right, don't force it." He nodded slowly, as if the weight of that decision was sinking in. "I just don't want to feel like I'm letting Mom down." I sighed, feeling a pang of sympathy for him. It was a tough spot to be in, wanting to forge your own path but feeling tethered to the people you care about. "You're not letting her down, Maddie. She wants what's best for you. But even she knows that you need to figure that out on your own. And she'll still love you, no matter what." He leaned back, staring up at the stars again. "I hope so." We sat there for a few more minutes, The silence between us feeling more comfortable now. Like we'd both said what needed to be said. I didn't have all the answers for him. And I didn't want to pretend like I did. But I knew that he was starting to figure it out. And that was all I could really hope for. You know, I said after a while. I've been thinking a lot about the choices I've made too. And one thing I've realized is that no matter how sure you are at the time, it's okay to question them later. It's okay to wonder if there's more out there. Or if maybe you've missed something along the way. Matty looked over at me. His eyebrows raised. You're questioning your choices? I smiled, shaking my head slightly. Not questioning them. Exactly. Just thinking about them differently. I've always been focused on freedom. On not being tied down. And that's given me a life I've loved. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I've been running from something that could have made my life fuller. Connection. You know? Being part of something bigger than just my own goals. He nodded, understanding dawning on his face. Like a family? Maybe, I admitted. Or maybe just deeper relationships. Ones that aren't so fleeting. I'm not sure yet, but I'm open to figuring it out. Matty smiled. A genuine, thoughtful smile. Sounds like you're still figuring things out too. I laughed. Yeah, I guess I am. Turns out you never really stop. He chuckled softly, and we both fell into an easy silence again. Watching the stars. There was something comforting about knowing that we didn't have to have all the answers right away. Life was messy and complicated, and the best we could do was make choices that felt true to who we were. Even if those choices changed over time. After a while, Matty stood up, stretching his arms above his head. I think I'm going to head to bed, he said, but thanks for talking to me. It really helped. I smiled up at him, feeling a sense of pride and relief. Anytime, Matty, I'm always here. As he turned to go back inside, I watched him disappear into the house. The door closing softly behind him. I stayed out on the porch a little longer. The cool air settling over me like a blanket. There was still a lot I didn't know. A lot I still had to figure out about my own life. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the questions. Maybe my life wasn't as simple or perfect as I'd once thought. But it was mine, and I was open to whatever came next. The next morning, the air in the house felt lighter. It was one of those crisp, cool autumn days where the sun shines brightly. But there's still a bite in the air, reminding you that winter is just around the corner. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee, and for the first time in days, I felt at ease. There were no lingering arguments, no unspoken tensions, just the quiet hum of the house and the sound of my own thoughts. Sarah came into the kitchen, her hair still a little messy from sleep, and smiled at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, simple one, but it was enough to tell me that things were finally starting to settle between us. Morning, she said, sitting down across from me. Morning, I replied, returning her smile. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee. It felt good, this sense of peace between us. We'd been through so much over the past few days, years. Really, and now it seemed like we were both finally starting to let go of some of the weight we'd been carrying. Matty seems different, Sarah said after a moment, breaking the silence, calmer, more sure of himself. I nodded. We had a good talk last night. He's still figuring things out. But I think he's starting to realize that he doesn't have to have all the answers right now. Sarah sighed, setting her cup down on the table. I know. I think I've been pushing him too hard. Trying to make sure he doesn't make the same mistakes I did. But I see now that I can't protect him from everything. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief that she was finally seeing it. You've done an amazing job, Sarah. Matty's a great kid, and that's because of you. But yeah, he's got to find his own way. And he'll make mistakes, but that's part of life. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I know, it's just hard to let go. I've spent so long being his mom, making sure he's okay, that I forgot how to be anything else. I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear that had driven so much of her behavior. She wasn't just afraid of Matty's future, she was afraid of what her life would look like without the constant responsibility of being his protector. It's okay to want something for yourself too, I said gently. You don't have to sacrifice everything. Matty's growing up, and that means you can start figuring out what you want now. Sarah looked at me, a soft smile tugging at her lips. I haven't thought about that in a long time. What I want. I've just been in survival mode for so long. I nodded, understanding that feeling all too well. Well, It's time. Maddie's going to be okay. And you deserve to have a life that's about more than just taking care of him. She smiled, a little wider this time. Yeah, maybe I do. I'm not sure what that looks like yet. But it's nice to think about. We sat in silence again, the weight of years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding finally lifting. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were on the same page. We'd found a way to move forward. Both of us, without the baggage that had been holding us back. Later that day, Matty came down, looking more relaxed than he had in days. He and Sarah exchanged a few words. Nothing too serious, but I could see the difference in the way they spoke to each other. There was less tension, more understanding. He wasn't just her little boy anymore. And I think she was finally starting to accept that. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod. A silent acknowledgement of the conversations we'd had and the steps he was starting to take toward figuring out his own path. I returned the nod, letting him know that I'd always be there if he needed me. But that I'd trusted him to find his way. As the day went on, I realized that this trip had changed more than just my relationship with Sarah and Matty. It had changed me. I'd come back to visit my family, thinking I had everything figured out, that my life was exactly the way I wanted it. But now, after everything we'd been through, I could see that there was more out there for me than I'd been willing to admit. I wasn't giving up on my freedom. I still loved my life in Central America, the business I'd built, the adventure of it all. But I was starting to see that maybe I didn't have to live in such extremes, running from responsibility, avoiding connection. Maybe there was a way to have both. The freedom I valued and the deeper relationships I'd been too afraid to seek out. That night, as I packed up my things, getting ready to head back to Central America the next morning, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. I didn't have all the answers yet, and I wasn't sure what the next chapter of my life would look like. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the questions. I wasn't afraid of what it might mean to let people in, to build something deeper with someone, or to allow myself to feel a sense of responsibility for more than just myself. As I zipped up my suitcase, I glanced over at my phone. There was a text from Matty, sent just a few minutes earlier. Thanks for everything, Uncle. I don't know what the future looks like yet, but I feel better about figuring it out. I'm really glad you came home. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest as I typed out a quick reply. You're going to do great, Matty. I'm proud of you. And don't worry, you've got plenty of time to figure things out. I put my phone down and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet settle around me. It was a strange feeling. This sense of openness to the unknown. I'd spent so much of my life avoiding the things that scared me: commitment, responsibility, vulnerability, but now, they didn't seem so scary anymore. They felt like possibilities. As I lay down that night, the stars shining through the window, I realized that this trip had given me more than just a chance to reconnect with my family. It had given me the chance to reconnect with a part of myself I'd been avoiding for years, the part that was open to change, to growth, to the idea that maybe freedom wasn't just about living without ties, but about finding the right ones. And for the first time, I was okay with not knowing exactly what came next. Life was messy, unpredictable, and full of surprises, but I was ready for it, whatever it brought.